Okay, well, let's get started. We are really, really thrilled that you're with us today. This is going to be a really kind of nuts and bolts session. It's a little different than a lot of our about some of our webinars because we're really going to go really deeply into the product. And this webinar is really aimed at our customers about how they'll actually be able to comply with the OFCCP's audit requirements using the PayEQ platform. So this is the kind of run of show for today. So first, we're going to do a little intro and housekeeping on what is required and where we should be going. So let me start with that. So we have, please, we want this to be very interactive. So use the key Q&A or the chat features to submit any questions that you might have. If you submit them anonymously using the Q&A, we won't be able to follow up with you directly to give you an answer if we don't cover it in today's webinar. So if you'd like a response, please make sure to submit your name just so that we know who we should reach out to and provide that information. We will be sending out both the deck and the recording of the webinar today. We're going to have for customers, we'll send out the kind of full recording with a deep dive into the product as well. We also have the live transcript enabled for this webinar. So if you want to use that feature, and it can be really, really handy, please turn it on in your Zoom toolbar now. And the last thing is that this is not legal advice. So although we're going to be talking about some changes with the law, Syndio is not a law firm, and this doesn't constitute legal advice. And while I am a lawyer, I'm not your lawyer. And so all of this information is provided as general background information and best practice guidance. But we're really thrilled that you are with us today. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about who we are. I think that most of the folks that are on this webinar are customers. And so many of you are very, very, very familiar with Syndio, but for folks who are not familiar with Syndio, Syndio is the leading, I will say, workplace analytics platform. We work with companies, more than 275 customers, more than 30% of Fortune's most admired organizations, to analyze pay and workplace equity, covering more than 7.4 million employees. What differentiates Syndio, I think, is this fact that we have this amazing mix of very sophisticated technology, truly best-in-class technology, but we also have expert advice and support spanning things like legal best practices and custom statistical analysis and total rewards expertise in reporting and communications. So that's a little bit about Syndio. And I am so thrilled today that I'm joined here by Olya. So I'm going to turn this over in just a very short minute to have Olya introduce herself. Olya leads all of the development of our PayEQ product. So there's no one better in the world, truly, to tell you how you can use technology to run these types of OFCCP analysis. So we're so thrilled that you're here with us today, Olya. But my name is Christine Hendrickson, and I sit on Syndio's strategy team. I'm a labor and employment attorney by background. So before I joined Syndio, I was working with my clients that were using the Syndio platform. I was a partner and the co-chair of the Pay Equity Group at Seyfarth Shaw. And in that capacity, I sat within our people analytics team, which also handled all of our OFCCP audits. So I did a lot of pay equity and a lot of OFCCP work when I was at Seyfarth. And I've handled well over 200 OFCCP audits in every region, in every region. So when I saw all of the changes that are going on with the with the OFCCP, Oli and I were talking about how much this was really going to impact federal contractors that are in the total reward space. And so we wanted to come together today to do a really nitty gritty webinar that will tell you, what are the kind of key changes that are coming with the new scheduling letter, especially as they impact total rewards and other PayEQ users, but also just more generally. So Olya, before we get into that, I wanted to see if you might be able to introduce yourself.
I'm so happy to be here today and to get the chance to share with everyone who's on the call. Oli Vanetsky, been at Syndio 3.5 years, and as Christine said, I'm our director of product for PayEQ. So excited to keep building new great features for PayEQ and also show you how the ones we have can already help you. Thanks, Christine.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's get into it. With the OFCCP's new changes, this is a little bit of the background. So if you're an employer who provides either goods or services to the federal government at a really, frankly, very low threshold, you are subject to audit by the U.S. Department of Labor's Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, or for the dorky, the OFC, including me, the OFCCP. And this includes the majority of Syndio customers are also federal contractors. So there's this kind of direct impact. And in fact, many of our customers use the Syndio platform to comply with the compensation portions of their OFCCP obligations. So you're subject to audit by the OFCCP if you're a federal contractor or subcontractor. And every single compliance evaluation begins or kicks off with a scheduling letter. And that letter notifies the contractor that they've been selected for an audit, and it identifies the location or the establishment that is going to be under audit. So for the OFCCP, they develop their plans very establishment by establishment, and so it identifies which exact establishment is under audit. And that letter is accompanied by an itemized listing of data that is to be submitted to the OFCCP regarding the contractor's affirmative action program right up front. And that all of the information that is included in that scheduling letter and itemized listing must be provided to the OFCCP within 30 days of the kickoff and the receipt of that audit. So it kicks off the audit and then it starts the clock. 30 days after you receive the letter, you have to submit all of this very, very detailed information to the OFCCP. So for folks who have never had the pleasure of an OFCCP audit, the changes that we're talking about today, which are the changes to the scheduling letter and the itemized listing, are a really big deal, because what it means is that you really have to have those things on hand and ready to go, because you only have the 30 days to gather it. And so if you are someone who's not conducted a pay equity analysis, or you don't know the factors that drive pay that we're going to be talking about, it's very, very difficult to accomplish all of those in that tiny 30-day window of the audit. So if we think of having to run a marathon, that's really kind of the sprint phase of that, because it's a lot to get done in a really short period of time. So the OFCCP originally proposed really significant revisions to that letter, that kickoff letter, in November 2022. And in April 2023, the OMB published a slightly revised version of the documents, and we were for review and comment. And there were a lot of comments that were made to the OFCCP's changes to the scheduling letter. And then just last month, on August 25th, the OFCCP announced that it had a final revised scheduling letter and itemized listing that applies to all service and supply, which is the majority of the compliance evaluations. And it went into effect kind of immediately. So it went into effect for anything that was scheduled on that day, actually scheduled on or after the 24th of August. And so everything that we're going to be talking about today applies to any new audit. So for the folks who just found out, they just got a new CSAL letter. You found out that, you're likely going to be audited, and you're likely going to have to provide this information as soon as you receive that scheduling letter. All of the things that we're going to be talking about will apply to that any new audit that is scheduled on or after the 24th of August. Okay, so as we can see on this slide, with the new scheduling letter, the OFCCP is really making two buckets of changes. They're expanding quite significantly the number and the type of materials that you're going to have to provide right up front. And if we thought about those into kind of two buckets, there's going to be changes that are that impact total rewards leaders and other pay EQ leaders. And those changes that we're going to be talking about are going to be the primary focus of our conversation today. But there's a lot of other changes that happened as a part of the scheduling letter, and we wanted to also mention those briefly. I will say that the changes that came with this scheduling letter impact total rewards hardest. The changes are most impactful for total rewards leaders for the reasons that we're going to be talking about as we go through this. And so I'm sorry to say that for so many of you today that are using PayEQ or are in the total reward space, that this is going to have a fairly heavy impact on the work that you're doing. And it's coming at such a cruddy time because we're, we're in budget season and we're gearing up for the comp cycle. So I know it's a really busy time of the year for all of you, but we did want to make sure that it was on your radar because some of these things are things that will take a little bit of planning to get your arms around, and we at least wanted to put it on your radar. Okay, so we've got the changes that impact PayEQ, and then we have the other changes. And the other changes, as Michelle is going to show in just a second, are these kinds of things. So we're not going to go through all of the ins and outs of every change that happened as a result of the scheduling letter, but these are some of the really big changes. The first one is that if you're an employer that has a campus-like setting, so what do I mean by a campus-like setting? I'll tell you in just a second. It says that if you have a campus-like setting and you maintain multiple affirmative action plans, you have to submit all of the AAPs for the campus, not just for higher ed. And you know what? So funny when I did a last minute spell check, I think I changed AAPs to apps, but you will know what I mean by affirmative action plans here when we'll change that when we send out the deck. This sounds like total minutia and only something that like dorky OFCCP attorneys would care about, but it actually like really matters. And it matters because federal contractors are required to develop affirmative action plans or AAPs for each establishment, which usually means like the physical office building that you're working in, unless you have special approval to create functional affirmative action plans, or that are called FAPs. So the OFCCP conducts compliance evaluations and related enforcement activity based on individual establishments. So if you're working on a building and if you're working at one building and you have another office that's a few blocks away, each of those would be a separate affirmative action plan. So imagine you're a big retailer and you have 10 different stores within a city. You would have potentially 10 different affirmative action plans, one for each one of those locations. So the OFCCP with this new scheduling letter says that when you have multiple buildings in a campus-like setting, and that could be like a higher education actual campus, or it could be like you have a corporate headquarters that has multiple buildings that all sit within the parts of the campus. You may have corporate folks in one office building, and you may have a distribution center, and you may have an R&D facility, and you may have historically created separate affirmative action plans for each of those locations. Now with the new scheduling letter, you actually have to submit all of those affirmative action plans for everyone, for all of those locations. So that's a big change. And that one actually does have a little bit of an impact for total rewards as well, because you may hear from your compliance team that they're also wanting you to run analyses looking at the rolled up version of those campus establishments, rather than as you've looked at them likely historically, kind of one by one. The other changes that we see is the OFCCP is entering the information age, maybe for the first time. No, they're not for the first time, but the OFCCP started during COVID issuing scheduling letters by email, because a lot of people were home and they weren't going into the office. And so the OFCCP said that if you received the scheduling letter that kicked off that audit by email and they received a read receipt, that would constitute kind of acceptance of the scheduling letter and kick off that 30-day period by which you need to submit your affirmative action plan. The new changes to the scheduling letter formalizes this practice. They also allow you to upload information and data to a secured site or submit it electronically. Interestingly, OFCCP is using Kiteworks, which is the exact same SFTP site that Syndio uses. So that was nice affirmation that we're on the right track in terms of security at Syndio as well. They also identified and provide information. They're going to be asking information about the AI that you're using, but in a very specific way. They're asking for information for you to identify any of the vendors that you're using to recruit or hire or screen that are using artificial intelligence or automated systems or technology-based selection processes. So that's a new requirement. And then the last one is definitely send coffee, a cup of coffee, or warm thoughts to your talent management and talent acquisition colleagues, because the OFCCP is going to be asking them for more information too. So this has these cross-functional impacts. They're going to be asking. OFCCP has a renewed focus on promotions and outreach efforts taken to remove barriers. So they must provide the documentation and policies related to promotions, and they may be providing more information about whether a promotion is competitive or not. And then they're also going to need to provide a significant amount of additional information about their outreach efforts. So that's kind of a high-level overview of these kind of other changes that are required by the OFCCP. Changes to the scheduling letter. The OFCCP actually put out this really nice, 19-minute video that describes, on the next slide, that describes kind of a lot of these other changes. So if you wanted a good quick primer, that's also another resource that we just wanted to make you aware of. Okay, but the big deal is that it's going to have an impact for total rewards leaders. And that's the heaviest impact with all of these changes. The changes definitely have these cross-functional impacts, but the changes that are codified in the new scheduling letter have the largest and an outsized impact as we think about compensation. And there's 5 new OFCCP requirements, really kind of 5.5, that impact total rewards and PayEQ users that we wanted to just make you aware of. I'm going to spend 10, 12 minutes on this, and then I'm going to turn this over to Olya to talk through, exactly how you would comply with these things in each of these within the PayEQ platform. So we wanted it to be a really practical of, this is what's required, but really, how would you do it? How would you accomplish it in PayEQ? Okay, so 5 new OFCCP requirements that came from this revision to the scheduling letter that impact total rewards. And this is written to look like it's almost a red line. So if you see the pink underline, those are the modifications or the changes that came about as part of this new scheduling letter. And what you'll see here is that the OFCCP, we're starting off with a kind of an easy change, but OFCCP is asking if the information is accessible that you provide it electronically. It's actually a little bit of a softening of what was previously in there, but the OFCCP is very clear that they're wanting employers to begin to provide this information electronically so that they can do the statistical analysis themselves. So the first change that happens is that electronic submission remains the name of the game. If the information is accessible in an electronic format, you're to provide it electronically, either through email to OFCCP or uploading it to Kiteworks in a more secured fashion. But the nice thing is, as Olya will talk about in a little bit, PayEQ can help here. So you can do this right within the PayEQ platform, as you can download the information that you'll ultimately need to be submitting to the OFCCP right from the PayEQ platform. So that's the first change, is that electronic submission remains the name of the game. It gets a little bit harder from here. The second requirement is that it used to be that the OFCCP would only require that contractors submit 1 year of compensation data to the OFCCP at the start of an audit. So as part of your submission to the OFCCP, you're required to provide an Excel file that, or a CSV file, or a Google sheet that contains the employee level compensation data for all employees. So it will be the employee's name or identification. It will be things like what date were they hired, and the like. And we'll get into that in a bit more. But you used to only have to provide that data just for a single year. And then the OFCCP would analyze that. And if they saw an issue, they would come back and ask for more data, and they could ask for the additional information. Well, that has changed with this new requirement, and that's meaningful to total rewards folks, because it means that right up front, you're going to have to be providing information for 2 years of compensation data. And we're going to show within the PayEQ platform kind of how you'll do that, how you can keep those separate so that you can download them as separate files and also analyze them separately. So Olya is going to talk about that more. But it also means the need for more analyses and more flexible analyses. And so I think one of the things that we hear a lot at Syndio is that this kind of like once a year analysis approach is really, really difficult, because with now these changes with the OFCCP, they're asking you to like look at data in so many different ways. So having the flexibility of technology really allows you to do that. So Olya is going to talk about that as well. Okay, the third requirement. This is a big one. This is a really big one, and probably the most meaty and meaningful, or among the most meaty and meaningful changes that we see with the OFCCP. The new itemized listing. It used to be that with the OFCCP, there were things that you had to provide kind of right up front. And those were things like either they're an employee identifier, and it would be what is their EEO1 category and what is their job family. But then there were things that you could provide. And those were things that were the actual factors that you were using to analyze compensation. What has changed now with the OFCCP is that they're saying you must provide right up front, 30 days after you receive the letter, the factors that you're using to determine compensation. And they give some examples here: education, experience, time in current position, duty location, etc. But job families and the like. These are in the PayEQ platform often considered to be those kind of the control factors that we're including in the statistical analysis. Well, why does this matter if you're a total rewards leader? Well, it matters a lot if you're a total rewards leader because for a couple of reasons. It matters because this is a much more total rewards informed OFCCP. They're talking about job families and subfamilies and geographic differentials. So one of the things that has changed is just that the OFCCP is much more kind of total rewards informed than they have been in the past. Pay explainability is also top of mind for OFCCP, and it's clear that they want each employer to know what are the factors that drive pay within their organizations. And it's not something that you can kind of figure out as you move through the audit. It's things that you must know right at the start of the audit. So more data and more upfront precision on those pay impacting factors are big parts of what has changed. The kind of three, I said that there was 5.5. The half change that we're seeing is that you have to, these are the must-haves. These are the things that you must provide. So you have to provide their base wage and their annualized base compensation. And you have to, and other compensation like bonuses or incentives, but it says it's not limited to. So the OFCCP is kind of clearly done with the shoulds. And what they're saying is that they're saying it's a must. You must submit this information, both additional data and additional pay impacting factors right up front at the start of the audit. It's not about shoulds. It's not if you can do that, you must know right at the beginning of an audit. And so for total rewards leaders, I think that the compliance teams are going to be coming to you and asking you, like, what are the factors that are driving compensation? Because we have to know those things up front. So that's the really, I think, nice thing about, as Olya will talk through, about the PayEQ platform, because it enables you to do that and know those things right up front. Okay, so that's number 3.5 and 3.5. But number 4 is that the OFCCP is looking for more total rewards policies and documents. Again, this is the OFCCP in the past were asking for information around policies, but they were not very specific about kind of what that is. And this goes to the idea that we're seeing a much more total rewards informed OFCCP. They know what they're looking for now. They're looking for information about job architecture and the use of prior salary and salary benchmarks. So my one ask as we come out of this, or one of the things that you may want to do as you come out of this, is start a folder. And as you're seeing things or you're coming across things, start to put it in there, because these are all information that your teams are going to be coming to you and asking, and that you're going to have to provide to OFCCP right up front. These are probably what you have in your compensation administration guidelines already. So you could use those to help with that. But it may be that if you're not documenting, that you're no longer using salary history and setting pay, you may want to consider to be much more explicit and have a policy or guidance around that, so that you can show that to the OFCCP, that that's just not something that your organization is taking into account. You're not taking into account prior pay in setting pay, for example. So again, we're seeing a more total rewards informed OFCCP who's requiring a lot more information, and it all has to come up front. The last requirement is that the OFCCP has a new upfront requirement to prove that you conducted the annual pay equity analysis. So federal contractors have always had the obligation, or have long had the obligation, that they have to conduct an annual analysis of its compensation systems to evaluate if there are any gender or race ethnicity-based disparities. And that has to be as part of your in-depth analysis of your total employment processes. So that requirement is not new. And also not new necessarily is the requirement that the OFCCP is asking you to prove prove it, prove that you conducted analyses, especially privilege, as part of the ongoing compliance valuation. But what is new is that you have to document it right up front at the beginning and the start of the audit, which means that it can't be something that you're running once you get the scheduling letter, because you're going to have to be able to show that this is something that you completed as part of your affirmative action planning. So there's 3 ways that you can conduct a privileged analysis and prove it to the OFCCP, and you can do those all with Syndio support. So and this comes as part of the OFCCP's revised directive 20 that came out in 2022 on August 18th. And in that, the OFCCP took the position that if employers were to conduct a privileged pay equity analysis which the vast majority of Syndio customers are doing, that you would have to prove that you conducted it to the OFCCP by either providing a redacted version of your compensation analysis, providing a detailed affidavit that summarizes the analysis details, or that you have to conduct 2 analyses, one privileged that you would keep and not share with OFCCP, and a non-privileged analysis that you would actually deliver to OFCCP. So while you can, and Syndio supports all 3 of these methods. And so I'm going to turn this over to Olya to talk a little bit about, we have these 5 kind of key changes, which is a much more total rewards informed OFCCP, who is asking for electronic submission of materials, who is asking for 2 years of pay data, who's asking for more data up front and asking you to define the pay impacting factors. And they're also asking you to prove that you conducted analyses. So Chris asked a great question, which is, does this apply to all employers, or does it apply if you have a certain employee threshold? So it applies if you're a federal contractor and you have the portion of this that applies to race and gender has a threshold of a contract of at least $50,000, a single contract of at least $50,000, which is actually quite easy to reach when you're talking about contracts with the federal government. And you have to have at least 50 employees. So if you have fewer than 50 employees, or you don't have a contract or subcontract of $50,000 or more, then it doesn't apply. But it would apply to everyone else. You're all subject to audit by the OFCCP. So that was a great question. Another great question is, does the OFCCP require that you demonstrate the analysis was completed, or do they also need to know that it was remediated? So you're not required directly to show that that remediation took place. Although OFCCP, with the changes to the scheduling letter, does ask that you provide more information about the good faith efforts that you take to close gaps across all of your employee processes. And so we are hearing that some employers are including that they conduct an analysis and they make wage changes as issues are identified as one of those good faith efforts, but defer to your legal team on whether or not that makes sense for your organization. So that was a really good question. Olya answered the question on the thresholds. We had another question about intersectional, whether the OFCCP requires that you conduct intersectional analyses, or if you have to look at it by race and gender. So the OFCCP, the submission that the OFCCP typically does is looking by gender and then race, ethnicity, kind of separate. But I have definitely seen the OFCCP more and more look at intersectional and compound discrimination as they go through OFCCP audits. And in fact, the OFCCP has a fairly new, maybe a couple of years, maybe almost 3 years old now, a new T TA guide. And in that, they specifically call out that the OFCCP is looking at intersectional and compound discrimination in addition to analysis, in addition to flags, that things that are flagging by race or ethnicity on a standalone. And so the nice thing I love as part of the intersectional budgeting, we didn't have time to get into intersectional budgeting in too deep of detail, but it will allow you to correct those intersectional gaps as well, which is very, 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 very nice. We also had a question about the AI provisions. If you're using it for pay equity, if you're using pay EQ, do you have to identify that you're using Syndio as part of that process? The answer is, certainly talk to your legal team and get their advice as to how they wish for you to handle that. But what the OFCCP, what the requirement is it's looking at AI that's used for recruiting, screening, or hiring. So kind of a subset of AI. And of course, the PayEQ platform is not used for recruiting, screening, or hiring itself. And so we have not heard folks identifying it or planning to identify that use as part of the OFCCP audit procedure, but totally defer to your legal team on that. And I think, let me see if there's anything else that we've missed. Oh, this is a great one. Does OFCCP provide any regulations on timing of when the pay equity analysis has to occur within the year? Yes and no. They provide information that it has to be based, the snapshot, the employee snapshot that you're submitting to OFCCP has to be aligned with your affirmative action plan. So federal contractors can pick the date that they want their affirmative action plan. So a lot of federal contractors have calendar year affirmative action plans. So they're based on an employee snapshot as of January 1st. And then they look at hires and promotions and terminations that occurred in the previous year. But there's nothing in the OFCCP's regulations that requires you to have a calendar year snapshot or a calendar year affirmative action plan. And so we have had employers that have chosen to have like mid-year or March or April or May affirmative action plan. So it's aligning with their merit cycle. So that their comp analysis and their pay equity analysis is running in line. The OFCCP does require that you conduct an annual analysis, so it has to happen sometime during that year, and then it does have to be, at least the information that you're submitting to OFCCP has to be based on the same snapshot that you're using to prepare your affirmative action plan. So that was a great question. And that's definitely one of the kind of strategic things that a lot of our customers are thinking about is like, what date does it make sense to make our affirmative action plan? Let me see if there are any other questions. Oh, Alexia had another great question. She said, with the 2 years of compensation data being required, would we need to perform 2 separate analyses, or is the analysis just performed in the current year and that you could provide the compensation data for the previous year? Great question. So you're having to submit that you conducted at least the most recent affirmative action plan, the most recent compensation analysis, documentation of the fact that it was conducted with that affidavit or by providing that information, but you have to have 2 years of data. Now, because it's an annual obligation to conduct the analysis, you will have likely also conducted one the previous year, but at least the affidavit just has to be specific to the most recent compensation analysis. Great question. And I think that is all of the questions, and we're now right at the top. So thank you all so much for attending. We're so grateful to have you, and so grateful to work with you at Syndio. Thank you all, and we'll talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.